So hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Newman, and I direct the Max Kade German American Research and Resource Center here at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, also known as IUPUI. I'd like to begin our event today by acknowledging that the land on which I am and which we would gather, or which we are gathering virtually, is the occupied and contested territory of Native peoples. We thus wish to acknowledge and honor the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples on whose ancestral homelands and resources the Indiana University system was built and currently occupies. I also wish to acknowledge that with its founding in 1969, IUPUI displaced a vibrant Black community in Indianapolis. To support some of the programs and investigate these connections and histories and support the communities that we have occupied, I would encourage you to attend events and send support in any form to two of our programs here at IUPUI, the Native American and Indigenous Studies program and the Africana Studies program. They have great big donate now buttons on their home pages, and I'll put those links in the chat presently. So before introducing our guest today, I want to take a moment to introduce the Max Kade Center. We are small, klein aber fein, as they say, small but mighty. We connect to the community, we give out multiple student scholarships, and then we host about 3 to 5 events per academic year that in some way connect to German or German American culture and history. Just as a sort of foreshadowing for those of you in the Indianapolis area, we'll have a talk on April 7th by Dr. Tina Grossman. And that will be at the IUPUI Campus Center, and I'll post a link to the Max Kade website. You can see the events there and find out more information about that as well. And then also on April 16th, for those who teach Deutsch als Fremdsprache, we're going to do a workshop with Iliana Hager on April 16th on the gender neutral pronoun XIR and how gender neutral pronouns can be used in the German language classroom. So next order of business, I want to clarify how our 90-minute event will sort of follow today. I will presently, I promise, introduce our guest, Dr. Adrienne Merritt, and Dr. Merritt will present their work for about 45 minutes. We'll conclude with a Q&A. I'll keep the chat open during the discussion or during the event if you want to put questions in there, although I ask that maybe we refrain from having a separate chat aside from the talk. And then also during the Q&A, you can either put your questions and comments into the chat and I can vocalize those for you, or if you want to use the raise hand feature, which for those of you who don't know, if you go to reactions, which is on the bottom of your screen, there's a raise hand button that you can press, and then I'll call on you so that you can vocalize your question or comment on your own. One other thing to note, this event is being recorded and we will publish it within about a week on our Max Kade YouTube channel. So you can rewatch it and send it to friends, family, and students who might be interested in Dr. Merritt's work. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce someone whose work I admire greatly. I have seen Adrienne present on or talk about such a wide array of subjects, from medieval topics to the Avengers or franchise and superhero movies to James Baldwin and pedagogy and activism and comics and much, much more. And every time I learn so much from her, and I'm just impressed by the breadth of knowledge that she has at her fingertips in this sort of intentional, careful way in which she treats and investigates her topics. And that's why I'm so excited to have her give a talk for us today. We share an alma mater in the University of Minnesota, where she did her BA and MA, and then she concluded her studies with a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. She's currently an assistant professor at the German at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her publications can be found in a variety of journals and edited volumes. There is a forthcoming article on Robert Muse's Törles in Monatsheften, and then another article looking at how to decenter Germanness as whiteness coming out in the Modern Languages Association series. So Adrienne's current research looks at Black and Afro-German cultural production, and activism in relation to identity, performance, and formation. This is part of her current book project, which our talk today, Weathering the Wake, Black German Ecologies, Cultural Production, and Communities, will further illuminate. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Adrienne Merritt. Thank you, Adrienne.
Thank you. So I want to first, before I put up my first slide, maybe I should do that now. I first want to thank Dr. Nicole Norman for helping to organize this event and inviting me into this virtual space today. I feel honored to be allowed the opportunity to share these thoughts. And just a heads up, I have a bit of a cold, so if there's a little bit of coughing, I apologize here and there. Secondly, I offer a positionality statement before reading the official land acknowledgement from the University of Colorado. I am a Black queer woman, an anti-racist activist and educator who is trained both as a generalist in German studies and Pan-Germanic medieval studies. In acknowledgement of my status in the United States, I also recognize the long history of violence that has impacted Indigenous populations in these lands. And this is the official University of Colorado land acknowledgement, so it's a little lengthy, but I feel it's appropriate in these events to read it in full. As we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are in the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homelands of Indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples to the fields of medicine, mathematics, government and military service, arts, literature, engineering, and more. We also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems Indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. We recognize and affirm the ties these nations have to their traditional homelands and the many Indigenous people who thrive in this place, alive and strong. We also acknowledge the painful history of ill treatment and forced removal that has had a profoundly negative impact on Native nations. We respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. We honor them and thank the Indigenous ancestors of this place. The University of Colorado pledges to provide educational opportunities for Native students, faculty, and staff, and advance our mission to understand the history and contemporary lives of Native peoples. I thank them for their stewardship and recognize the historical and current injustices that continue to enact trauma on the Dakota and Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone peoples. I begin this talk with the declaration of my identity and PhD training, as well as land acknowledgements, for the sake of transparency and to outline, I believe, the ways in which my own position have informed and continue to guide my interest in and perspective about Black diaspora living in German-speaking countries. As a Black person of mixed heritage, born and raised in the United States, understanding Blackness within the framework of the diaspora is personal and scholarly, with the central intention of depicting the multifaceted nature of the Black identity globally through the lens of cultural production. The voices that are and have been traditionally included within German studies speak to the injustices that Black and Brown peoples have faced in the United States and abroad, as well as the erasure of their presence in national historical narratives, their impact upon the arts and cultures, and their significance in shaping these nations. As someone with mixed race heritage, giving a talk for Indiana University just days after a senator made references to a time before the nationwide legalization of interracial marriages gives me pause. Anti-miscegenation laws, at times legally enforced, at times ignored, had different degrees of legality throughout the United States until Loving versus Virginia in 1967, a mere 14 years before I was born. These laws were reenacted, borrowed, and emendated by other nations. And for the sake of this talk, it is important to remember that Germany and German colonies were just such a nation, drawing near hot and eager interplay of discourses and dialogues across the Atlantic into the 20th century. But there is more to anti-miscegenation laws than simply a desire to keep that which is deemed racially different separate. There's an underlying emphasis on the development, recapitulation, and resuscitation of racial difference, one that can and has been tied to nation, citizenship, and belonging. More simply put, to quote Taole Goff, as she has reminded us, skin color is the only passport that matters. What does it mean to be at home in Germany? How does it figure into a sense of dwelling and belonging, particularly when you are part of the Black diaspora? Black History Month, a celebration of the collaboration, contribution, and sacrifice that Black people, the diaspora, have made, one that has and continues to be relegated to electives, supplementary chapters or sections, or in the worst of situations, erased from local and national narratives, is now over. And even by uttering this, I note a sense of cynical irony in devoting a month, only a month, to that supposed sense of care. Initiated by Carter G. Woodson in 1926, first as Negro History Week, later becoming Black History Month, Woodson, like Du Bois, felt a pressing need for African Americans to have a better knowledge and understanding of their heritage. Along similar lines, Black History Month celebrations in Germany, particularly in Berlin, challenged and directly confronted the overwhelming lack of knowledge concerning Black German heritage, but also sought to connect people of the Black diaspora through film, poetry, activism, and scholarship. As Tiffany Florville outlines in her recent monograph, Mobilizing Black Germany, Black History Month in Berlin became an integral way with which to attend to and address the needs and concerns of Black Germans and other marginalized peoples. Through collaboration with a variety of local and international organizations, Black History Month in Berlin encompassed panels, seminars, lectures, film showings, concerts, poetry readings, workshops, and parties that celebrated Blackness in its multitude forms and manifestations. However, to simply state that these celebrations were solely activities would be misleading. Florville notes, Black History Month, quote, was a clear manifestation of Black diasporic politics and solidarity, end quote. Although brought together for celebration, she goes on to clarify that Black History Month provided Black Germans with a sense of belonging with their compatriots and others. The recognition and celebration of Black history within a local German context and a broader European one proved a vital component of the Black German movement precisely because it strengthened their claims of kinship with their nation and the larger diaspora, end quote. Forging kinships was and is crucial for Black Germans, particularly those who have grown up in white families or raised without connections to Black communities or role models. Additionally, connection to the broader diaspora, both various African nations and other diasporic communities worldwide, including the United States, encouraged solidarity in an ever-changing definition and redefinition of self through cultural and communal exchanges. Florville goes on to state that the Black History Month events in Berlin, quote, emboldened Black Germans to pursue spatial politics that rooted them in the German nation, created physical geographies and intellectual and figurative sites, and showed their resilience and agency, end quote. As I will briefly explore with this talk, the creation of Black spaces within the geography of white Germanness stands as a central motivation for Black and Afro-Germans seeking community with one another. It is their attempts to weather the wake that is, quote, the totality of our environments. The weather is the total climate, and that climate is anti-Black, end quote. At the same time, and I hope that my talk realizes the ability to touch upon this, quote, weather necessitates changeability and improvisation. It is the atmospheric condition of time and place. It produces new ecologies, end quote. And that is from Sharp's book In the Wake. In the production of new ecologies through kinships and communities, breathing space and breathtaking spaces allow for life in all its vibrancy. In many ways, Black History Month provides a path into the heart of my discussion today. With this talk, I focus on the complex and oft overlooked concept of social ecologies for Black German populations living in Berlin currently, and how they impact the lives of Black Germans, both born in Germany and those who migrate or take refuge in that space. I highlight the ways in which fostering community creates a break from the continual onslaught of waves of harm in the form of institutional whiteness, a space within which Black Germans can thrive and forge new kinships. My discussion is multifaceted, incorporating history, colonial imaginaries and fantasies, art and literary works, as well as community and identity construction, exploration, and naming. Although one might typically connect the word ecology with the natural sciences, the root of the word extends back to antiquity, synonymous with the concept of home, both one that is made, one that is sought after, and one that perhaps remains elusive for a variety of reasons. In reality, although I approach this topic through social ecologies of Black German communities, the core of my argument and the broader questions behind my monograph research remains the question of how one navigates the odyssey towards home, whether it be a homecoming, a desire for a lost home, or the manifestation of home through community building and cultural production. I choose the word navigating and manifestation purposely, bringing together the concept of home, homecoming, and the search for one's place, space, home with a voyage or odyssey, particularly through a variety of terrains and across water. As Christina Sharp discusses in the Wake on Blackness and Being, the ripple effect of colonialism and the slave trade that spread in waves across oceans, lands, and seas is much further reaching and impacting than the confines of time, space, or national borders. The colonial imaginary and fantasies that led to the events of the Middle Passage, although reverberating in different ways, nonetheless led to a diaspora of peoples of varying connectedness who now build and rebuild their lives and communities in the wake of those passing ships. And while I will be the first among many to state that my intent is not to force Black German studies to be a subfield of Black or African diaspora studies, I think it would also be untoward of me to pretend that no connection exists between the legislation, treatment, stereotypes, and imaginaries that surround Black populations of the diaspora in Europe and the Americas today. I will explore some of these transatlantic connections, in particular through the collaboration and shared inspiration in cultural production and community organizing. A communal understanding of the importance of Black History Month, hip hop, poetics, and the influence of African art, mythology, and language are only a few of these transatlantic connections. At the same time, the Black and Afro-German populations living in Germany today should not be reduced to a singularity, nor is simply an offshoot of Black American cultures. If anything, one aim I have with this talk is to explore only a glimpse into the myriad forms of communities, varying definitions and understanding of what it means to be Black and German, and imagine worlds and futures in which Black and Afro-Germans can thrive and find joy. I begin this talk by outlining a definition of ecology, both in its etymology and how it connects to this discussion. I resituate ecology within Black studies and away from a purely scientific understanding of the term. I use ecology and social environments as a transitory point to foray into a discussion of Christina Sharp's concept of living in the wake and what it means to be surrounded by and resist the impact of colonialism and the colonial imaginary. Although water is a primary metaphor in Sharp's In the Wake, the title for this talk is born from the fourth chapter of her monograph, entitled The Weather. And the focus of this paper is the ways in which Black German communities find ways to create breaks from the waves and weathers of exclusion and erasure. For this reason, I draw upon Tiffany Lethabo King's work on the Black shoals to explore the ways in which the shoals constitute a disruption, a pause, a break that resists, even if momentarily, the impact of the waves as, quote, spaces of contact, friction, and interaction, end quote, as a, quote, location made of both water and not water, end quote. That in-betweenness is relative and highly conducive to my discussion of people who identify as both Black and German. Surrounded by a sea of whiteness, Black and Afro-Germans are often excluded from a definition of Germanness, as has been developed over the centuries of German philosophical and historical research. At the same time, that concept of Germanness is neither fixed nor singular, modulating, continually redefined and reestablished as a society within Germany migrates, arrives, and turns away from the antiquated tomes of the past. Lethabo King's work, in turn, opens up dialogue with Tina Kampt in the concepts of stasis, stillness, and practices of refusal. And although I have limited time to explore this today, I tend to to these connections in my monograph length project on Black joy communities and visions of homecoming. I argue that the shoals can present the opportunity for respite, for a momentary break from the onslaught of an at times inhospitable and uninhabitable environment of the urban and social ecology for Black and Afro-Germans, particularly through the nefarious quotidian specter of Alltagsrassismus, everyday racism. In the shoals of their communities, Black and Afro-Germans can celebrate each other, recognize the multitude versions of Blackness, and take pause and space to explore, imagine, and redefine future possible environments and urban spaces that live outside of the current space-times. To exemplify the significance of community, I turn to examples from personal narratives of Black Germans to close this talk, specifically interviews with Kenyan German rapper Leila Akini, filmmaker, activist, and scholar, Dr. Natasha Kelly, and one of the women she highlighted in her film Millie's Erwachen, Millie's Awakening, named Nadu. Creating space for their voices to be heard is paramount, not only to understand Black German communities, but also the concept of wake work as Black annotation and redaction, as consciousness, refusal, and aspiration, which reverberates throughout this talk. I thank them for having the opportunity to listen to their words. So it's a note on position and influence. Throughout my discussion, I'm mindful of the fact that I'm referencing Black studies scholars who in general have an eye on the Americas, the Middle Passage, afterlives, and differing histories of colonialism. And yet the theories and rationalizations that fueled and validated the anti-Black racism behind the transatlantic slave trade were born in Europe. The ship that crossed the Atlantic did not fund itself. That ship, even before its creation, was haunted by the imagination of a subservient and subhuman Black other. And Europe benefited, both in goods, ideas, and wealth, from that convenient eradication of humanness. Even a country such as Germany, who boasts the fact that there was no legalized slavery within its borders, fails to commune with its ghosts, denies the connection between its haunting and its Heimat, forgetting that the ghosts are, in reality, more real than the overarching and nebulous concepts of nation, state, and citizen. After all, Anton Wilhelm Amo was twice enslaved, in spite of his moves to refusal or at least pushback against the portrayal and discussion of Blackness in 18th century Germany. Oops. I would like to take a brief moment to discuss the term ecology, its etymology and history before continuing on to Sharp's wake work and King's Black Shoals, because in my opinion, it outlines the connection not only between Sharp and King's theoretical concepts, but also demonstrates the appropriateness of using ecology in this talk. Astrid Schwarz and Kurt Jacks credit the first use of the word ecology, Ökologie, to German zoologist Ernst Haeckel in his 1866 book, Generelle Morphologie der Organismen. Derived from the Greek word oikos, meaning house, household, dwelling place, a place to live, and even family, Ökologie, later spelled with a K in 1890, was defined initially as, quote, whole science of the relations of the organism to its surrounding outside world, end quote. In reality, the concept has been traced back as far as Greek philosophy, particularly Theophrastus, sorry. But for my purposes, I will focus on the specific term ecology and its definitions. Although the term gained some traction with a handful of authors, 1885 marks the broader scientific usage of ecology. The year 1885 is notable. The so-called Congo Conference in Berlin ended in 1885, which, quote, consolidated the pattern of colonial rule over Africa, end quote, during which time, quote, racism reached its greatest heights as public policy, end quote. I mention this fact to preface the conflict between scientific objectivity and the social realities of the time, and to point to one example of many that signal the ways in which science is still interpreted by individuals who are influenced by their own perspective and position in their findings. As Schwartz and Yax outline, a century after its first published usage in the public usage in the 1960s, ecology, quote, served to blur the boundaries between scientific, philosophical, and political knowledge. And at the methodological level, there was a merging of facts and values, the epistemic and the social, end quote. The definition of ecology is nebulous at best, used to convey varying social and political motivations depending upon the positionality of the writer speaker. Oops. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines ecology as, quote, the concept of the environment, which includes both other organisms and physical surroundings. It involves relationships between individuals within a population and between individuals of different populations, end quote. Even in this brief discussion of the term, ecology shifts in focus, encompassing scientific, political, and social understandings of the world. For my purposes, ecology provides an opportune entry point into the understanding the multifaceted situation of Black Germans and the urban, social, and natural environments within which they live. The diffuse concept of ecology that defies a finite definition bodes well with Christina Sharp's exploration of the word wake. The wake existing as the marks left on the surface of water, the recoil of a gun, the mourning and remembrance of a person's death, and the opposite of sleeping, i.e. to wake. Through its numerous definitions, wake speaks to both the natural ecologies around us, i.e. water, land, and social practices, that is mourning the dead, that reflect the relationships between individuals, alluding to the innumerable factors that impact the life of a person. Outside influences on the life of an individual or group guides my discussions to Sharp's concept of the wake. In her monograph, In the Wake on Blackness and Being, Sharp initiates her theory with an admixture of the personal and scholarly, using the word wake in its many definitions to voyage through some of the complexities of living while Black. Central to her discussion is the image of the slave ship crossing the Middle Passage. The weight of that ship displaces water as it moves, thereby creating a wake. Wake, the track left on the water's surface by a ship, the disturbance caused by a body swimming or moved in water. It is the air currents behind a body in flight, a region of disturbed flow. At the same time, a wake can also be defined as a, quote, particular pattern of waves, quote, that spreads out from the bow of the ship in the, quote, recognizable V pattern on either side of and then behind the ship, end quote. Those transverse waves might, quote, look straight, but are actually arcs of a circle. And every instant that the boat is moving through water, it has the potential to generate a new wave, end quote. That is to say that the scope and spread of the waves created by the water displaced by the ship's motion is far-reaching, circular, and if unimpeded by a critical mass or dampening, incessant. Here, the wave does not necessarily mean a physical one, although one might still point to the ships crossing the Mediterranean, ships and individuals aboard those ships to decide the fate of those fleeing across the churning waters. In Sharp's monograph, the focus is the impact of the ship, the displacement that it left in the wake of slavery. The ship leaves in its wake racism, colonialism, forced migration. As Sharp outlines then, quote, the question for theory is how to live in the wake of slavery, in slavery's afterlives, the afterlife of property, how, in short, to inhabit and rupture this episteme with our noble lives, end quote. In the case of Germany, its racism and the Black populations living there, I reconsider the concept of the wake and cycle back to the definition of ecology. Rather than the documented and easily charted histories of slavery on American soil, and in this sense, I mean American as the Americas, living in the wake is further reaching, extending back to what Suzanne Zentrop called, quote, armchair conquistadors, end quote, and fantastic voyages that cast Germans as the main actors in the adventure of colonial conquest. Those colonial fantasies, as she calls them, infiltrated philosophical, scientific, and literary imaginations until the dream could only lead to a reality. That is not to say that the institution of slavery did not impact or influence German anti-Black racism. More so, I state this to elucidate the possibility that, quote, the significance of colonial fantasies in the formation of German national identity and of race relations within Germany, end quote, which stood, quote, in opposition to the perceived racial, sexual, ethnic, or national characteristics of others, Europeans and non-Europeans alike, end quote, sought to define Germanness as much as it imagined an other. The social ecologies in Germany, taken together with Germany's short colonial period and documented and undocumented treatment of Black and Brown peoples, presents obstacles and harsh social terrains that have, until the past few decades, remained unacknowledged. Returning to Sharp, her response to the question of living in the wake of the slave ship is what she calls wake work, or, quote, to imagine new ways to live in the wake of slavery and slavery's afterlives, to survive and more the afterlife of property, end quote. Wake work is consciousness, it is rupture, it is discontinuity. But how can we, Black people of the diaspora, disrupt something that is incessant and purposeful? One that, like waves streaming diagonally out from the bow of a ship, is not only far-reaching, but impacts spaces, times, and bodies who never witness the initial ship's passing. Living in the wake signifies a lack of grounding, a realization of the ongoing processes that are the waves of slavery and displacement. Rather than moving in a linear fashion, waves are circular and encompassing, imprisoning, entombing, and enwombing. Living in the wake and wake work are, in essence, a process of disorientation, a failing to land or ground oneself in a particular time or space, a realization that, quote, in the wake, the past that is not past reappears, always, to rupture the present, end quote. Addressing the concept of disorientation, in queer phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed describes disorientation as occurring, quote, when we fail to sink into the ground, which means that the ground itself is disturbed, which also disturbs what gathers on the ground, end quote. And yet disorientation, the incessant rolling and force from the waves of the wake also signifies, quote, how objects are gathered to create a ground or to clear a space on the ground, end quote. Rather than the habitual or unconscious inhabitation of space, that grounding of whiteness in institutions, structures, and unracialized bodies, disorientation from living in the wake allows bodies, quote, to create a ground, end quote, a space, a break. Bridging the gaps between the movement of the wake and the disorientation of claiming ground, I turn to Tiffany Lothabo King's monograph, The Black Shoals, which I believe provides a fruitful intersection between Sharp, Ahmed, and the understanding of ecology I have outlined thus far. In ecological terms, the shoal, Tiffany Lothabo King states, is, quote, a particularly shifty formation, end quote, and, quote, is as much a dynamic and moving set of processes and ecological relations as it is a longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates that that cartographers attempt to fix in time and space, end quote. The shoals being somewhere between land and water, quote, an ecotonal location made of both water and not water, end quote, which marks the, quote, combination or meeting of at least two distinct ecological zones, end quote. As a site of methodology and potential analysis, the Black Shoals constitutes a movement and convergence, gathering, reassembling, and coming together or apart. In other words, quote, the Black Shoals are a part of the uncharted and at times invisible geographies of everyday Black life and ritual, end quote. And, quote, stages an extended rumination on the theoretical, methodological, creative, and ethical potential of Black fungibility as a way of articulating a world-altering mode of existence, end quote. For the purpose of my discussion today, The Black Shoals disrupts the commonly held notion of being caught on a wave, of being displaced or moved at the will of the power of the waves, or being caught in the wake of some greater thing passing by. But the case of peoples of the Black diaspora, it robs them of the potential for agency in the telling, retelling, and remembering of their histories. Focusing solely on water, rather than water and non-water liminal spaces of the shoal, situates Black people and studies as at the mercy of others, as framed and influenced by something outside or other than themselves. But what I've come to notice is that framework is, in and of itself, a product of the long and unfortunately undying spectral reach of colonialism and imperialism. Reading through Tiffany Lathabo King's monograph caused me to reconsider how I thought about the search for home, joy, and community in the African diaspora communities of Germany. Excuse me. In particular, I was struck by the concept of the shoals, what that means in terms of ecology and geography, the concepts of progress and delay, and the ever-developing idea of modernity in urban existence. In many ways, society at large in the postmodern age is taught to understand progress as something positive, something that moves forward, that creates and improves the lives, institutions, and communities that it touches. At the same time, I cannot deny that slowing down, taking time to enjoy, to pay respect and attention to something or someone is invaluable to not simply survival, but the potential for one or something to thrive. A conflict of interest exists between that which is achieved and the method of means of that achievement. Reading Tiffany Lathabo King's Black Shoals in conversation with Sharp's wake work as consciousness and rupture, and Ahmed's reformulation of disorientation exposes the potential for new theoretical understandings of community, joy, and solidarity in Black German communities. Finding the shoals, finding ground, becomes a part of wake work, a liminal space undefined and unmappable by the harsh ecologies of spectral colonialism and its imaginaries and legacies. Fostering community through activism and cultural production has many forms and meanings for Black and Afro-Germans. I turn now to their voices, beginning with Leila Akini. Blending activism, artistry, and poetics, Kenyan-German rapper Leila Akini has a growing stage presence in Germany. Born in Kenya and raised in Cologne, Leila Akini was drawn to rap early on, leading her to develop tracks such as Afro Shpatana, Oyoyo Numbani, and Alien. In a 2019 interview, she remarked that for her, quote, rap is a way of expressing herself. It's a mode of communication and expression. She grew up with it and she thought, I love it and I want to do it, end quote. In episode 4 of the series Berliner Farben, filmed in 2017, Akini speaks candidly about her motivations for performing and the connections she fosters by way of her music. I want to stand for love, for strength. I want to stand for community as a motivation for people too. I want to stand for self-love, for self-acceptance too. Since I published Afro Shpatana, I've learned a great deal because I'm suddenly thinking about it even more than before, or that I'm thinking more about these people who then come up to me, talk to me, and I motivate them. Okay, because people just need that too. That's an important part that I've also taken on. I think I'll grow with it too. That's a big role, I'd say. Sometimes I find myself overwhelmed because I've been able to prepare for it, but maybe it's good that I've been able to prepare for it. Then I can approach the matter naturally and honestly. At first glance, Akini's love and joy for performing is palpable, seconded only by the emphasis on the benefits of developing community and reaching out to her fans. The need for community and understanding resides in her words, pinpointing the ongoing desire to find acceptance, support, and belonging in the Black diaspora living in Berlin. Similar to the Bundestreffens of the Initiative Schwarze Deutsche, through Akini's music, quote, Black Germans can escape their isolation. They can find a shared sense of happiness and pursue an ethic of love, end quote. Her track, Afro-Spartana, released in 2016, addresses head-on the harmful stereotypes associated with Black people living in Germany, particularly those stereotypes directed at Black women. Rather than lament the situation of Black people and women, Akini exposes these stereotypes as the senseless and misplaced notions that they are. I'm going to play a short clip. I hope that my volume is enough.
Spielt mein Verstand Junges Akini, serviert ihr Deutsch-Rap mit Geschmack. Nur weil ihr denkt, dass ich nichts auf die Reihe bekomme. Wer hat Angst vor der schwarzen Frau? Wenn ich komm, ich bin schwarz. Ich kann mich zur Musik gut bewegen, ich bin schwarz. Und jeder, der mir kommt, entgegenguckt, weil
In many ways, the joy Akini expresses with the lines Ich bin schwarz and Wer hat Angst vor der schwarze Frau expresses a strength and solidarity to her listeners, a resistance to being classified or viewed solely through the lens of whiteness. As Tiffany Flurva describes about the impact of the Bundestreffen, quote, being around their Black compatriots and others was a welcome respite after their often exhausting racist experiences in German society, end quote. I believe that in similar ways, Leila Akini's Afro-Spartana creates a break through its conscious rejection of common Black stereotypes, in turn allowing some welcome respite for Black listeners through its sound waves. And I don't have the space to go into it right now, but part of Christina Sharp's fourth chapter, The Weather, she discusses part of wake work as Black annotation and Black redaction. And I think in many ways, Akini's Afro-Spartana is that move of Black annotation and redaction of those stereotypes that are inadvertently forced upon her. Along similar lines, Akini's track Alien from 2018 speaks directly against the erasure of what might be read as a non-German, read non-white, appearance and a sense of belonging, as well as questions of citizenship. The hook pushes back against assertions proclaiming, I'm not an alien, an outsider in the middle of it. I go against the current. My paths lead to Rome. I'm no alien, an outsider in the middle of it. I have a clip here.
Ich bin kein Alien, Außenseiter mittendrin. Ich laufe gegen den Strom, wenn ich Gefühl nach ich bin ein Alien, Außenseiter mittendrin. Ich bin kein Alien, Außenseiter mittendrin. Ich laufe gegen den Strom, wenn ich Gefühl nach ich bin ein Alien, Außenseiter mittendrin.
Standing amid fellow Germans, in particular Black and Brown Germans, Akini pushes back against the denial of her belonging and Germanness in community through music and in dance. Through the choice of the word alien, Akini plays upon historic attempts to treat outsiders as something other, something potentially less than human. Akini turns these archaic concepts on their head, embodying not the alien status of immigrant, but the superpowered otherworldly figure of alien from sci-fi. Turning to Natasha Kelly's art and activism, the concern for community, communities, and creating spaces for Black German female artists to be heard is paramount. The companion volume to her Biennale film, Millie's Erwachen, Millie's Awakening, Dr. Natasha Kelly centers the voices of Black German female artists exploring their life stories, their art, and their opinions about being Black and German in its multitude forms. In the introduction to her book, Kelly establishes the motivation and significance of the interviews in Millie's Erwachen, highlighting the opportunity afforded by the publication of the book and how it connected and differed from her documentary film. quote, crucial to me was that each episode amounted to a whole, i.e. that it could be sewn together in Afro-cultural tradition to create a quilt. On the other hand, there's a lack of documentation of Black histories, whatever the reasons may be. Too often we have failed to capture the socio-political developments in this country and our individual experiences that arise hereof from our own self-determined Black perspective. As a result, the following generations often lack identity models and best case or worst case examples. Like many before me, I wanted to break down this discontinuity, because in order to claim a place in society for us as a community, we need to demand our place permanently. Therefore, I decided to edit this publication in addition to my film, in which the interviews are printed unabridged and unfiltered. And I would say also this demand for place permanently connects to Tina Camp's work on stillness and stasis and diaspora, not as movement, but as in a practice of refusal against movement or migration. Similar to the African tradition of the quilt, which calls to mind the story quilt specifically, Kelly outlines that her approach to the documentary and her book are interconnected and integral to the community of the Black diaspora in Germany. Through the development of her documentary, Kelly reached out to women she knew on Facebook, reconnected with women she had met at ESD Bundestreffens in the past, and fostered a new and also continuing sense of community in process and progress. Creating the space for these Black and Afro-German women to speak and enabling ways for their stories to be told and disseminated throughout the Black diaspora and beyond has a twofold ability of enacting wake work in the German context and, quote, finding ground, and, quote, documenting what Kelly calls her stories, to occupy that space in between, to connect, to disrupt white Germanness and acquire or regain footing in German society. Excuse me. One of the episodes in Kelly's documentary and book was the interview with Nadu. Born in 1955 in Detmold, Nadu spent the first years of her life in a children's home. Her mother remarried and she was reconciled with her mother and new stepfather, moving to Iceland for several years. After some time, Nadu and her family returned to Germany where, as Natasha Kelly describes, quote, her everyday life was marked by racism, sexism, and homophobia, end quote. Through art, specifically the African tradition Nadu describes as medicine mass, she found a source of expression. Nadu reached out to Kelly after she read an interview in Taz about Kelly's theater piece, My Sister. A member of the Black Germans group during the 1970s in Berlin, Nadu recounts a sense of community, but also pitfalls she encountered living as a Black woman in Germany at that time. Remembering her activism and community, when asked if she has a memory of a particular encounter, Nadu replies, quote, yes, Guy Saint-Louis. She was a woman who initiated our Black women's group back then. She was very aware of herself, very aware that she was a Black woman with all the obstacles that come with it. But she always fought and also struggled to be recognized and heard as a Black woman. She was so important to us as a group because she had the ability to voice and to express in an understandable way what we could merely think, end quote. Honesty about one's place in society, how one positions oneself and moves, is echoed in both Leila Akini and Natasha Kelly's statements above. Finding one's voice and seeking to be heard, the community of the Black women's group gave language to the ineffable experience of living while Black in Germany. In particular, the connection with Guy Saint-Louis and others in the Black women's group was crucial due to the impact of intersectional issues that lie even at the heart of the women's movement. As Nadu explains, quote, you have to imagine it this way. They all came from universities, were eloquent, could talk well, and also conduct disputes. We could only say what we didn't want, but we could hardly say what we wanted. And then we said, okay, we'll meet again and try to explain it to them again. We then talked for a long time, trying to make them understand that they can't treat us that way or that we're not worthless just because we're Black. But they denied that they'd even behaved that way. And I have to say in retrospect that they didn't really understand that we wanted things to happen without their influence, end quote. The women's movement, despite its claim to focus on equality and inclusion of all women, fell short for Black women when they sought out participation in the feminist activism, a point voiced by numerous Black intellectuals, artists, and poets during the 1970s and beyond, including Audre Lorde. Although their attempts to join with white women in the movement did not prove fruitful, fostering and developing community in its wake allowed the space for quote, new footing, different chords of embodied rhythms, and new conceptual tools to navigate its terrain, end quote, in the Black shoals of the Black women's group. Nadu reflects upon the connection between finding one's roots and finding other Black Germans. Quote, we were each other's reflections. I mean, we all grew up in a white society. Most of us didn't know other Black people. And even if we had already started searching for our roots, something was still missing. But if I talk about myself now, I have the feeling that I grew up with this German culture. And that is also a strong part of me, sophisticated and all. But there's also something else in me that nobody conveyed and nobody could. So there was still something I wanted to know or wanted to experience or wanted to be. And the others felt more or less the same, even if we couldn't articulate it at the time. We were kind of confused in some way, I think, but we knew we had a longing that was common to us all, end quote. But the heart of my talk today has been the intersection between the social ecologies of Germany, in particular Berlin, and the ways in which Black and Afro-German peoples create and foster community that disrupts and breaks from the incessant influence of living in the wake. Through art, music, and film, stories are told that have been otherwise silenced, passing along knowledge to present to present and future generations. From Black History Month celebrations that connect Black and Afro-Germans to one another in the broader diaspora, to the documentation of histories, and personal narratives, community is not singular in form or function, but something that can provide connection to gain new footing and shape oneself in that gathering. I close with Nadu and her sentiments about her political and personal activism. When asked if she was politically active in any way, Nadu responded, well, I think what we did was political, namely that we found ourselves, because out of nothing, you cannot act. Politically, you are then absolutely ineffective. We couldn't get a foot on the ground. We couldn't stand on our own, but I would still say that we were political. That was our intention. And I think that it was also political that we wanted to write a book, that we were on the radio. In my perspective, these are all political actions. Even if all this was relatively miserable in the outcome, it wasn't about becoming famous or anything, but just about going our way tenaciously. And I can't say that we failed, end quote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. That was lovely. We do have some good time. If there are any questions or comments that anyone would like to share, again, you're welcome to place them in the chat and I can voice them for you. Or if you'd like to use the utilize the raise hand function on reactions, I'd be very happy to have you voice that and turn on your camera as well so that you can talk to Adrienne directly. Is there anyone that wants to start with anything? Otherwise, I'm happy to engage a bit as well. So Adrienne, if I hadn't read Sharp's work before and hadn't thought about wake work in that way. And I'm just, as I was thinking about it, as you sort of beforehand, just by reading your abstract and then a little bit as you've spoken, it seems that, and if I understand Sharp correctly, right, that there's this disturbance that happens, that's what the wake work encompasses. But then I sort of wonder in that metaphor, or maybe it's about the shoals, you know, because water returns to whatever its state of placidity, right, or that it returns to being controlled by the currents and that sort of thing. And I wonder how that metaphor can be expended when we think about wake work. If it's really about that action in that moment of disturbance and interruption, what happens after? Is that where the shoals part comes in? I was just wondering if you could kind of get to that a little bit for me, help me think through that with you.
Mm-hmm. So I was thinking more along the lines of Sharpe's use of wake as and connecting it to ecology and weather, so that it is something that is environmental and it is surrounding, so that it is more viewed as a constant. And so, and then in refusal or rejection of that constant, that's where the shoals come in, because it is not land, it is not water, it is something that's in between, where it can be impacted by it, but it can be that, and Tiffany Lethabo King sets this up as the shoals sometimes could be disastrous for the ships as they head to land if they aren't noticed, but it can also be a stopping point, that in between point between water and then arriving on the shore. And that in that moment, there is this mutability that exists, which is similar to the shoal, because the shoal is not a permanent land formation. It is something that is continually developing and then also eroding. So there is this parallel to what others have discussed, Fred Moten and many others, about Black fungibility, and that there is this, that because there's an impermanence. What does that mean to dwell in an impermanence? And what does that mean to continue to survive in impermanence and reject that as a status? I don't know if that cleared up your
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. That helps. Oh, please continue if you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say that refusal is the wake work. It is the consciousness. It is a mode of seeing and knowledge searching that is not, that invests in ways that tend to, it recognizes structures as they are, meaning the structures that maybe are continually feed into what Sharpe describes as the wake, but it's more than that. And I find that you have to, it is a process of almost not waiting, but of understanding. And this is why I think community is important, of the interconnectivity between different things. You cannot simply take Sharpe's work or King's work and apply it to Germany. You have to think about what that potentially means for their distinct ecological environments. How do individuals engage with one another? What does that mean in terms of the history, in terms of the activism, in terms of the stories and narratives and bodies within those spaces?
Thank you so much. Is there anyone that has a question or comment? I want to make sure to give space to everyone.
Yeah, hi, I have one question. You mentioned,
yeah, thank you,
the relationship between the feminists in general and the Afro-German females, and that wasn't a good fit and so on. That's a very interesting sociological topic to explore. Did you do anything more on that, or why not? I think that there would be a natural intersection, and of course, given the racial aspects of it, I suppose that maybe the feminist group was not as open as they should have been in that regard. It's just a fascinating sociological thing played out here too, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was something that in many ways I don't take the time for it here, because people have invested in it. Faba Buchanan and Showing Our Colors, did talk about this, but even before that, this was, I think that's in many ways why Audre Lorde's work resonated so well in Germany, was because of her discussions of the transformation of silence into language and action, for example, or a litany for survival. There are many works where she's specifically addressing that despite being in spaces, she is not a part of those spaces. And it kind of You know, the willingness for participation does not necessarily resolve or culminate into an acceptance or collaboration. And unfortunately, because it meant that the way that feminism was being defined, or at least how the narrative and the political narrative, socio-political narrative was being defined in Germany in the 1970s, I would say, did not seek to incorporate a variety of experiences. And it was it became very troubling. I mean, because there was multiple levels of attempted erasure, especially for Black and Afro-German women, but also those who had lesbian or queer identities as well.
Thank you, Giles. Yeah, Jeanette, please.
Yeah, so if we then go into the 80s, we have this, you know, the initiative of Black Germans, and out of that came the ADEFRA, which was this grassroots activist group for women founded by Black women in Germany. So I think in the 1980s, you know, things started moving. And funny thing is that one of the founders of ADEFRA, Katharina Oguntoye, just received the Bundesverdienstkreuz just recently. So I think with the initiative of Black Germans, where we really for the first time kind of organized, first it was more like, oh, being amongst, you know, your own peers and not having to explain things and all of that. Then after the fun was over, or we were like, okay, we partied enough, now it's time to become politically involved, you know, and do something. And ever since then, you know, things have moved ahead. And I think what was started then, kind of like, you know, we might see now 40 years later, you know, some results of that. So yeah.
No, definitely. But for me, part of it, that was why looking to Nadu's word and talking about, because it actually, she reached out to Natasha Kelly because of this interview, and she's talking about the 1980s in particular, what you were just mentioning. But then Nadu was saying, but I was around in the 70s doing this. And so it was this realization that not all of the story of this development was being told. And the fact that this is something that, 2016, 2017, she's having to remind people, it also it shows that there has been developments, there has been grassroots political organizing and establishment of communities and connections, but there's also been disruptions because of, I would say, flows of information, or, Natasha Kelly also notes in her introduction the difficulty that some of the people that she reached out to were no longer alive. That was also a reality of kind of telling the story, is that there were silences, there were ruptures that you had difficulty moving past because people, some it was suicide, others, it was disease, but that's also the reality of the situation, Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jeanette. Also, just Adrienne, I don't know if you have the chat open, but I did want to draw attention that there are some accolades and some appreciation for your work as well. And it's good that you hear and know that people have been enjoying your talk so far. Other comments, questions that you would like to share? Again, you can put that in the chat. You're welcome to raise your hand as well. I wanted to return a little bit to Alien. I was interested sort of in that, the title of the song being in English, and just expand on that a little bit about, it seems to me that is that word has a lot of political impact, right, in English and in German as well. But do you read that as part of this mutability and trying to find, to be at home, to find the space, the in-betweenness, that it's also just being in between language, that's something that comes out of it? And you hear, you do hear, especially in discourses of racial and political justice in Germany today, there is a mishmash of German and English and Denglish together. And I wondered if you had thought about that or had any thoughts about that.
Well, I also think it's part of the kind of core development of hip hop when you think about sampling, which of course goes much further back than hip hop. I mean, we can't. This is a long legacy of Black and African musical forms and reference. But I mean, especially I would say hip hop. There is always a presence. It's multilingual and almost. I didn't play any clips from it, but Oyoyo Niambani, the chorus is in Leila Akini's. There's actually 2 tracks that talk to one another. Megalo's Oyoyo, which was filmed in Uganda, and there is everything from Pidgin, German, Igbo in the track, and Leila Akini's response to it, which came out just a couple of months later and uses the same hook, is she is Swahili, German, and Igbo. So it's I think that there in many ways for me that is simply the language of the diaspora, in many ways acknowledging that there are kind of connections. And so I think that the multi-referentiality of the word alien, I mean, I would read it as purposeful. If you watch the entirety of the video, sometimes it will be a flash of people's eyes that are kind of an otherworldly color, and a part of it, the beginning is an interrogation that kind of parallels by somebody who seems to be almost like a border security or police officer or something that's interrogating Leila Akini. And so I believe that between some of the references of, you see masks, you see very brightly dyed hair, you see fashion that doesn't try to move to the background and doesn't try to fix itself to a particular time and space. I would argue that that's meant to be that blurring of that word.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Lynn, please.
I'm muted. Thanks, Adrienne, for your talk. And my question brings together, I think, Nicole's question and some of the comments you were just making. And it's something I'm thinking about, so I'm trying to formulate it as I'm thinking. And it all builds on the really powerful work with metaphors that you're doing in your paper and probably the bigger book project. And I'm wondering, like, the specific question is about the creation of forging kinship and creating Black spaces in Germany. And you mentioned you're focusing on Berlin, and I'm really curious about what these spaces look like beyond Berlin in Germany. And I'm also wondering if you're working with Black spaces in a metaphorical sense, that maybe it's productive to not think of particular cities, but when you talk about the music, I hear the music as a space. So I was just wondering if space has a metaphorical valence in your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there, and that's, I think, where I find the duality of Sarah Ahmed's reading of disorientation is very kind of fruitful, in terms of it's not a particular space, meaning not a particular grounding in a locality or in even a temporal setting. I mean, if you look at the work Afrofuturism or Afropessimism, that is also, alive and well in Germany. These spaces, it's not space. It is, and that's where I find ecology becomes very productive, I guess, or generative, and talking about some of this, because it's not something that needs to be tangible, right? It is not something that is fixed. And there's sometimes set locations for Bundestreffen, but there's sometimes they're not, they're moved around, right? There's also histories, along a tradition of in other cities of Black History Month, but then there's also exchanges and also sharing of knowledge in a variety of ways. And I'm actually kind of interested in what the expanding virtual space, right, does in terms of creating this. I mean, thinking about just in general, Andre Brock's work on Black Twitter and kind of like worlds within worlds, and it's there and it's present, and that it sometimes fluctuates, but it's there to be found if there is a desire to search that out, right? But I also think it's, for me, I was trying to focus on things that turn away from the academic and the kind of media discourses of Black suffering and trauma. And I think that's it's tricky because, you, on the one level, you kind of, you engage with working through this, but this is where I find Sharp's work to be kind of helpful in this regard, that there is the realization of the weather, of the environment, of the ecology, but that is not the only thing that defines you. That is not the only thing that surmounts to a life lived. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's levels of metaphor, but it's also real, is what I want to, I guess, what I would like to end with, is that even though it's not a fixed location, it doesn't make it any less real or potential, or, for that livability.
Thank you. Miriam?
Hello, greetings from Hamburg. Thank you very much for your talk. It really resonated a lot with me. And I just thought I would add another question, if you could expand a little bit on the topic of discontinuities between the different generations, because I'm thinking a lot about this topic as well, and I don't find it easy to grasp how these discontinuities happened or are continuing to happen, because on the other hand, I see also a lot of documentation, especially from the 80s, but also from earlier on, and I see a lot of activists from this time are still being around and doing a lot of amazing work. And sometimes I'm really wondering how there's so little, how the number of people who knows about this activism is still so small. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this.
About the shoals specifically and how it fits with discontinuity, or just discontinuity in general? Sorry, I just want to make sure I understood your
I think just in general between, concerning Black feminist activism in Germany. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'll be honest, for me, I think that's a difficult question to answer. I don't know that. I mean, and this is why I didn't get to do it in this talk. in this version of the talk, but this is also when I'm drawn to Tina Camp's definitions of stasis and stillness and diasporic dwelling, because I think that what I wonder is because she also discusses kind of the haptic nature of Black existence, but also of that reaching out, of that it's multi-sensory. So what I'm wondering is, maybe discontinuity is not the right word, but I wonder if there is and I don't want to use the word relatability, because that's not necessarily true. What I think is there's the and I know I'm blanking on who wrote this article, but the kind of the plural selves kind of that exists. And what I'm wondering is that there are knowledges within knowledges that are both shared and accessible, and those which are maintained as private. And I think sometimes I'm kind of searching for connections that even as I believe it was Jeanette mentioned before, about first the excitement and then the political activism, that you know, that there is that personal and kind of intermingled political always in existence. But I wonder if we kind of think about it more as a performed stillness, the kind of pulling upon that there it is there is the potentiality for it, should we take the time to find a different way of seeing and knowing and world making and building and ecologies and other things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I wonder if it's a difficult kind of two-way motion at times of drawing together and wanting to focus, but then also to preserve or maintain what is private and individual and personal. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I feel like it's a complicated navigation, and I think, but I also think that in general, you know, when some people don't know, especially maybe not searching out Black diasporic communities, there is kind of I've often heard people say, well, I didn't know, or I didn't realize. And I mean, yeah, sure, some of this knowledge was in private archives, which I remember your talk at the DDGC about what was it, the archive is a treasure, right? Right, and things to be behold and beheld, right? Which is, it brings up into and to treasure. But it is a good question. But I do wonder if it is sometimes in the inexpressibility of not always knowing how to articulate in various spaces, and that creates at times an inability to transfer, or I don't know how to describe it. I'm not articulating this well, but it is something that is a very good question.
No, thank you very much. And I really like the idea of stillness also. I can't explain it, but that seems to be a good concept there. Thank you.
Yeah, there's actually a good, in thinking about that, because it's from Tina Kemp's article on performing stillness. She says, and this is on page 161, that she talks about the consequences of diaspora not as movement, but as creative forms of dwelling in everyday acts of refusal to capitulate to the status of outsider, refusal to be made invisible, refusals that engage. In this case, she's talking about photographs, family photographs, the photographs as a site of memory and self-fashioning, but a quiet but resonant enunciation of personhood and subjectivity in the face of racialized negation. And she goes on to talk about diasporic homemaking and homeostasis. And I do think that practices, her discussion of practices of refusal, there's a lot of potential there in terms of thinking and bringing it kind of full circle, not just within photography, but expanding more what does that mean? How is that reverberated? How, do we recognize stasis? Do we recognize stillness? Are we attending to what the layers, the depth that is there in a suspended action, or the choice of a refusal of movement or action in the form of dwelling?
I put that citation into the chat for anyone that might want to read the Kemp text as well. Adrienne, just a couple more comments popped up for people that had to leave. Again, expressing gratitude and thanks. And on behalf of everyone that's attended and been with us this afternoon, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have pages of notes, as I'm sure many of you do as well, and a wonderful reading list and points to think about. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone who attended. And again, Adrienne, thank you for the wonderful talk and for your time this afternoon. We are so happy. You can unmute and give her a round of applause. It is well deserved. So
thank you very much. Thank you everybody for attending. I know Zoom is draining and there are lots of talks.